The horse drew the line between the living world and the dead one. Behind Eli Thatcher, the prairie stretched out vast and indifferent, a sea of sun-scorched grass under a pale, endless sky. Ahead lay Alder Gulch, a festering wound in the dust. It was not a town born of hope, but one carved out by greed, its buildings leaning against each other like tired, drunken men. The heat was a physical thing, a weight on his shoulders that made the leather of his saddle creak and the sweat on his brow feel like grit. He had been following the whispers for 200 miles, whispers that drifted from one cow camp to the next, carried by freighters and prospectors with haunted eyes. They spoke of a man named Reed, a mayor who ran his town like a private fiefdom, and of a woman, a rancher's widow, who now belonged to him. The words they used were soft and ugly, a private arrangement, a debt paid in flesh and shame. Those words had a familiar, sickening taste, a taste that pulled Eli from his path and pointed him toward the heat and the dust of this place. Alder Gulch did not welcome him. No one did. Men stood in the slivers of shade cast by wooden awnings, their hands never far from the guns on their hips. Their eyes, narrowed against the glare, followed his progress down the single, rutted street. They were not lawmen, just predators marking their territory. Every movement here felt like a challenge or a surrender. A woman scurried across the street, her head bowed, clutching a basket as if it were a shield. A dog with its ribs showing slunk into an alleyway. The air was thick with the smell of dust, manure, and something else, the stale, metallic scent of fear. Eli swung down from his horse in front of the livery, the muscles in his back and legs tight from days in the saddle. He was a tall man, built lean and hard, with a face that had been weathered by sun and sorrow. His eyes, a pale, clear blue, missed nothing. He handed the reins to a lanky boy who looked at him with a mixture of awe and caution. "Just water and feed for now," Eli said. His voice was low and quiet, a stark contrast to the town's simmering hostility. "I will not be long." He did not have to ask where to go. In a town like this, the heart of the rot was always the saloon. The double doors of the gilded cage were propped open, leaking the sound of a tinny piano and coarse laughter into the street. Eli pushed through them and stepped inside. The light was dim, the air heavy with the stench of cheap whiskey, sweat, and unwashed bodies. A haze of smoke hung in the air, catching the weak afternoon light in dusty golden shafts. Men crowded the bar and slumped over card tables, their faces grim or flushed with drink. He took it all in with a slow, sweeping glance, his posture relaxed but ready. He was just a rider passing through, another nameless face in a room full of them. He moved to a spot at the far end of the bar, a place where he could keep his back to the wall and watch the room. And then he saw her. She was standing behind the bar, pouring a measure of whiskey into a dirty glass. Her dress was a deep, jarring crimson, the color of a fresh wound. It was made of a cheap, shiny fabric that caught the dim light. But it was the collar that held his attention. It was high and tight against her throat, fastened with a row of tiny, dark buttons, as if to ward off a chill that did not exist in this suffocating heat. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back so severely it stretched the skin at her temples. Her name, he would learn later, was Clara Bell. But in that moment, she was just a ghost in a red dress. Her face was pale, her expression utterly vacant. She moved with a slow, mechanical grace, her hands refilling glasses, wiping the scarred wooden counter, her eyes fixed on nothing. They were large, dark eyes, but they were as empty as a house where everyone had died. As she reached for a bottle, the sleeve of her dress rode up just enough for him to see the faint, yellowed mottling of old bruises that circled her wrist like a grim bracelet. A thick-set man with a florid face and a stained vest reached out and grabbed her arm as she passed. A little smile for a thirsty man. "Clara," he slurred, his grip tightening. She did not flinch. She did not even seem to register the touch. the casual ownership in it. Her face remained a perfect, still mask. "Let go of me, Silas," she said, her voice a monotone. "A dead thing." "I paid for my drink." The man, Silas, growled. "I reckon that buys me a look at your pretty face. Now smile for me." He gave her arm a sharp tug, pulling her off balance. The room did not react. This was sport, or perhaps just the normal weather in Alder Gulch. But Eli moved. He did not raise his voice, did not draw his gun. He simply shifted his weight and took one step away from the bar, placing himself directly beside the man. He was taller than Silas by a head, and though he was leaner, there was a coiled stillness in him that was far more menacing than the other man's bluster. He did not look at Silas. He looked at the bartender down the way. "Whiskey," Eli said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the noise. Silas turned, his face contorting in drunken anger. "Wait your turn, friend." Eli's gaze finally drifted down to meet the man's eyes. It was not a threatening look. It was calm, steady, and utterly dismissive. Then, his eyes moved pointedly to the man's hand, still clamped around Clara's arm. He said nothing. He did not have to. The pressure of his silence was heavier than any threat. For a long moment, the air crackled. Silas felt it. He saw the cold, clear depth in the stranger's eyes, the complete absence of fear or hesitation. It was like looking at a wolf that had not decided yet whether or not you were worth the trouble. With a curse muttered under his breath, Silas released Clara's arm, shoving her away slightly. "Sour bitch anyway," he grumbled, turning back to his drink. Eli watched him for another second before turning his attention back to the bar. Clara stood there, rubbing her arm where the man had held it. She straightened her sleeve, her movements precise and automatic. She picked up a glass and a bottle and slid the drink in front of Eli. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He saw a flicker of something in their depths, not gratitude, but a cold, weary resentment. It was the look of an animal in a trap that has grown tired of people trying to pry the steel jaws apart, knowing it will only hurt more. She turned away without a word, her back ramrod straight, the crimson dress a shout in the grimy darkness. He did not touch his whiskey. He laid a coin on the bar, turned, and walked back out into the blinding sun. The image of her blank face was burned into his mind, and with it came another, older memory, rising up like bile in his throat. The memory was of a different kind of dirt, not the dry dust of the plains, but the damp, cold earth of a freshly dug grave. He remembered the feel of the shovel in his hands, the shocking weight of each spadeful of soil. He remembered the simple pine box that held what was left of his sister, Lydia. She had been 17, with a laugh like wind chimes and a fierce, trusting heart. Eli had been away, working a cattle drive, trying to earn enough to buy them a small piece of land where she would be safe. He had been too late. When he returned, he found their small homestead cold and empty. The story came to him in pieces, from neighbors who spoke in hushed, fearful tones. The county sheriff, a man with a greedy smile and hollow eyes, had come with a warrant for a debt their father had supposedly left. A fiction. He had taken Lydia, not to the county jail, but to a wagon waiting on the edge of town, selling her to men who dealt in human misery. Eli had tracked them for a week, a cold fury burning in his gut. He found the wagon, but he found Lydia's broken body in a shallow ditch a mile from it. He had buried her himself, under a lone cottonwood tree, and as he patted the last of the earth into place, he had made a vow. He had sworn it to her memory, to the cold ground, and to whatever God might be listening. He would never again be too late. He would never again stand by while cruelty wore the mask of the law and preyed on the helpless. Now, standing in the oppressive heat of Alder Gulch, that old vow felt like a fresh wound. The woman in the saloon was not his sister, but he saw the same trapped look in her eyes, the same extinguishing of a soul. He had seen it too many times in the years since Lydia's death. It was a look that always stopped him in his tracks, that always forced his hand. He spent the rest of the day asking quiet questions. He bought oats from the general store and spoke to the clerk, a nervous man with sweat-stained armpits. He paid the livery boy a little extra and listened to his gossip. He spoke to a blacksmith shoeing a horse, a man whose powerful arms did not disguise the fear in his eyes. The story was just as the whispers had said, only worse up close. Clara Bell had come here with her husband, Samuel. They had bought a good piece of land up in the valley, a place with a steady creek. They were building a life. But Mayor Reed wanted the water rights. He had made an offer, and Samuel Bell had refused. Not long after, Samuel was found dead on his own land, shot in the back. They called it an accident, a stray bullet from a hunter. No one believed it. Before Clara could even properly mourn, Mayor Reed had appeared with a ledger and a lawyer. He claimed her husband had owed him a staggering sum of money, debts for supplies and loans. The documents looked official. The judge, a man who drank nightly at Reed's private table, signed off on them. Just like that. Clara lost everything. The land, the house, the livestock. It all went to Reed to settle the debt. But the mayor was a man of supposed charity. He had told the town he would not see a widow cast out into the street. He had made her an offer, a private arrangement. He would forgive the remainder of the debt, and in return, she would work for him at the Gilded Cage, a property he also owned. She was not a prisoner in chains, but she was a prisoner all the same. She lived in a small room above the saloon, owned nothing, and was watched constantly. She was Reed's property, a symbol of his power, a warning to anyone else who might think of defying him. Eli's jaw was tight as he listened. It was the same story, just with different names and a different town. A wolf in a fancy coat, a legal document that was nothing but a lie, and a woman broken into pieces to serve a powerful man's greed. He did not ride out the next morning. He told the livery boy he was staying on a few days, that his horse needed the rest. He found odd jobs to cover his keep. He helped the blacksmith mend a wagon wheel, his powerful, steady hands making quick work of the task. He spent a day helping a homesteader shore up a collapsing barn roof, the honest sweat a welcome relief. The pay was little, but it gave him a reason to be there, a way to move through the town without raising too much suspicion. And he watched. He saw Mayor Reed, a man who was always smiling, always pressing flesh. He was handsome in a soft, predatory way, with a thick mustache and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the dust and grime. He treated Clara with a public courtesy that was more chilling than any open cruelty. He would touch her shoulder as he passed, a gesture of possession for all to see. Eli saw Clara move through her days like a phantom. During the day, she cleaned the saloon, her face always turned down, her movements small and contained. At night, she put on the crimson dress and served drinks, her expression never changing. Eli would sit in the same corner, nursing a single beer for an hour, his presence a quiet, steady fact. He never approached her, never spoke to her. He just watched, his blue eyes taking in every detail. The way she flinched when a man's voice was raised too loud, the way she held her hands clasped tightly in front of her when she was not working, as if to hold herself together. For days, she did not seem to notice him. He was just another shadow in a room full of them. But then, one evening, she did. He was watching her as she stood by the end of the bar, waiting for an order. Her eyes, which were usually fixed on the middle distance, suddenly lifted and met his across the smoky room. For a long second, they just looked at each other. He did not look away, did not try to hide the fact he had been watching. His gaze was not hungry or pitying. It was just there, steady and patient. A flicker of confusion crossed her face before she broke the contact and turned away, her movements suddenly stiff. After that, she was aware of him. She felt his eyes on her as she worked, a quiet weight that was different from the leering stares of the other men. It unnerved her. Finally, one night, after the last of the drunks had been thrown out into the street. She found him waiting in the alley beside the saloon. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, and the air had finally cooled. He was leaning against the rough-hewn wall of the building, a silhouette in the darkness. She stopped, her hand flying to the high collar of her dress. "Are you following me?" she asked, her voice sharp with a brittleness that had been absent before. It was the first time he had heard any real emotion in it. He pushed himself off the wall, but made no move to come closer. "Just getting some air." She gave a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "There is no air in this town, just dust and rot." She took a half step toward him, her chin lifted in defiance. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes dark pools of shadow. "What do you want? I see you. You sit in that saloon every night, watching me. What is it you are waiting for?" He was silent for a moment, just regarding her. He could see the tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders. She was a bowstring pulled too tight, ready to snap. "You think I need saving?" she finally spat, the words laced with cold sarcasm. She had seen men like him before, men who thought a grand gesture or a fist fight could fix a woman's life. They were fools, and dangerous ones at that. Eli's expression did not change. His voice, when he spoke, was as quiet as the night around them. "No," he said. "I think you're just tired of pretending you do not." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her carefully constructed wall of indifference, the numbness she had cultivated for months, suddenly cracked. He was not looking at the woman in the crimson dress, the mayor's possession. He was looking at her, at the exhausted soul trapped inside. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she fought them down with a ferocity born of long practice. To cry was to show a weakness she could not afford. She said nothing else. She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the boarding house. But the echo of his words followed her. A strange and charged tension now existed between them. She could no longer ignore him. She started to notice things. She saw him give the last of his dinner to the starving dog that lived in the alley. She saw him speak to the old woman at the general store with a gentleness and respect no one else ever showed her. She saw the way other men, even the loud and belligerent ones, quieted when he was near, sensing the solid, unyielding core of him. He was a decent man. The thought was terrifying. And he never touched her. He never tried to corner her, never spoke to her again after that night in the alley. When he came to the saloon, he ordered his drink from the bartender, not from her. His eyes still found her, but his gaze was a question, not a demand. He was waiting. She did not know for what, but the patience of it was a pressure all its own. She began to fear him. It was a strange, unfamiliar fear, entirely different from the dread she felt whenever Mayor Reed was near. She feared Reed because she knew exactly what he was capable of, what he wanted from her. She feared this stranger, Eli Thatcher, because he seemed to want nothing at all. And in that nothing, in that quiet, waiting decency, she felt the faint, terrifying flutter of something she had thought long dead, a flicker of hope. And hope, Clara knew, was the cruelest thing of all. It was the thing that made you feel the pain again, that made you believe you could be whole, right before the world broke you one last time. Eli did not dig for the truth with a shovel. He uncovered it with his eyes and ears. He spent his days doing honest labor. But his real work began when the sun was low and the town's shadows grew long and talkative. He learned that the corruption in Alder Gulch was not a single rot, but a tangled root system that fed every part of the town. Mayor Reed was the taproot, but he was not alone. He watched the sheriff, a man named Cowboy, a paunchy, lazy figure who spent most of his time sweating in a chair tipped back against his office wall. Calloway's eyes were never still, always scanning, not for trouble, but for his master's approval. Eli saw money pass between the two men in a back alley, a discreet exchange that was over in a second. He saw Calloway arrest a prospector on a flimsy charge of disturbing the peace, only to release him after the man's small claim was signed over to one of Reed's associates. The law here was not a shield for the innocent. It was a club used by the powerful. Then there was the judge, an elderly man named Hemlock with a drinker's tremor in his hands and a film of moral compromise over his eyes. Eli saw him leaving Reed's sprawling house late one night, walking with the unsteady gait of a man full of fine brandy and self-loathing. Legal documents in Alder Gulch were only as true as the ink on Reed's ledger. He learned of other women, too. A seamstress whose husband had died in a supposed hunting accident, who now did all of the mayor's mending for free to pay off an invented loan. A young woman who had come to town to be a teacher, only to find the schoolhouse mysteriously condemned and her contract voided, forcing her into service at the hotel Reed also owned. Clara was not the first, and she would not be the last. Reed collected broken people, especially women, the way other men collected trophies. He broke them with paper and ink, with the slow, crushing weight of debts that could never be repaid. A week after his arrival, under the cover of a moonless night, Eli rode out of town. He followed a trail that led up into the low hills, toward the valley he had heard the locals speak of. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. After an hour, he found it, the Bell property. He dismounted and walked through the skeletal remains of a gate that hung from a single hinge. The house was a small, dark shape against the stars, a place where a dream had died. The door was ajar, and inside, the moonlight illuminated a scene of quiet desolation. A table was overturned. Scraps of what might have been curtains fluttered from a broken window. Everything of value had been stripped away, leaving only the shell. He could almost feel the echoes of the life that had been lived here, the laughter, the arguments, the simple, shared hopes. Now, there was only a profound and heavy silence. Outside, a short distance from the house, he found the grave. It was marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray. Samuel Bell. The name was barely visible. The plot was overgrown with weeds, a tangle of thorns and thistle that clawed at his boots as he approached. No one had tended to it. No one had been allowed to. This was not just neglect. It was a calculated act of cruelty, an erasure of a man's memory. Eli knelt. He pulled off his gloves and began to clear the grave with his bare hands, yanking out the tough, thorny weeds one by one until the mound of earth was clear. His hands were scratched and bleeding by the time he was done. But he did not feel the sting. He righted the cross and packed the dirt firmly around its base. It was a small, inadequate gesture, but it was something. He stayed there for a long time, a silent sentinel in the darkness, the weight of the town's sins pressing down on him. He was no longer just passing through. He was anchored here now, tied to this desecrated ground and to the ghost of the woman who had been forced to leave it. Clara felt the shift in the air long before the storm broke. A new man had arrived in town, an associate of Reed's from a northern mining camp. He was a coarse, brutal man with hands like shovels and a gaze that stripped a woman bare. Reed was fawning over him, buying him drinks, clapping him on the back. They spent hours in a corner of the saloon, their heads together, talking in low murmurs. One evening, as she was refilling their glasses, Clara lingered for a moment too long, her movements slow and deliberate. She kept her eyes downcast, pretending to wipe a spill from the table, and she heard the words that would turn her blood to ice. "She is a fine-looking piece, I will give you that," the mining man said, his voice a low rumble. "Clean. My men would appreciate a fresh face." Reed chuckled, a sound like oil slithering over stone. "She has spirit, but it is well trained. A month of your hospitality is more than fair for the water access you are guaranteeing me. I will have the transport arranged by the end of the week. She will be your payment." Clara did not react. Her hand remained steady as she finished wiping the table. Her face was a perfect, placid mask, but inside, a raw, primal terror clawed at her throat. A mining camp. She knew what that meant. It was a place where women disappeared, used up and discarded like empty ore sacks. It was a death sentence, a final, filthy end to a life that had already been stripped of everything that mattered. She straightened up and walked away, her spine rigid. Each step an act of supreme control over the screaming panic that threatened to consume her. That night, she sought him out. She found Eli behind the blacksmith's shop, mending a piece of harness by the light of a lantern. The rhythmic scrape of his knife against the leather was the only sound. He looked up as she approached, his hands stilling. He saw the new, fragile tension in her, the terror she was trying so desperately to hide behind a wall of bitterness. "You are still here," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he replied, his voice calm and even. She stood there, wringing her hands. The words she needed to say stuck in her throat. She could not tell him what she had heard. To speak it would be to make it real, to admit the finality of her situation. So instead, she spoke of something else entirely, something from a life so distant it felt like it had belonged to another person. "I was going to open a school," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. The confession was ripped from her, raw and bleeding. "Right there, on our land, for the girls from the ranches, so they would not have to depend on a husband's ledger to know if they were being cheated, so they could read their own Bibles, their own letters." She gave a dry, ragged laugh. "Now look at me. I have trouble reading the label on a whiskey bottle without my hands starting to shake." Eli put down the harness and the knife. He gave her his full attention, listening not just to the words, but to the vast, aching loss behind them. He saw the intelligent, hopeful young woman she had been, a woman who believed in the power of words to build a better world. When she was finished, he did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply nodded, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding that was more comforting than any promise. The next afternoon, as she was sweeping the saloon floor before the evening crowd arrived, he appeared in the doorway. He walked over to her, his step silent on the dusty floorboards. In his hands, he held a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. He held it out to her. "This is for you." She stared at it, then at him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and a painful, burgeoning curiosity. She did not reach for it. He placed it gently on the bar. "It is just a book," he said, and then he turned and left as quietly as he had come. She waited until he was gone before she approached the parcel. Her hands trembled as she untied the simple string and unwrapped the rough homespun cloth. It was a book, as he had said, a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. The cover was frayed at the edges, the pages soft with use. It was a story about a woman who had suffered, who had been wronged, but who had held on to the core of herself with a fierce and unyielding strength. She did not open it in front of him. She clutched it to her chest, a physical weight, a secret. That night, in her small, lonely room above the saloon, she did not sleep. By the flickering light of a single candle, she read The World of Alder Gulch, of Mayor Reed and the mining camp, fell away. For the first time in a very long time, she was not just a victim. She was a reader, a traveler in someone else's world. And in the quiet of her room, a forgotten part of her own soul began to stir. She read until the candle sputtered and died, and she kept reading as the first gray light of dawn seeped through her window, her eyes burning but her heart aching with a feeling that was dangerously close to hope. The violence, when it came, was sudden and absolute. It was a Saturday night, and the saloon was packed. A group of rowdy cattle drovers had come to town, their pockets full of money and their heads full of whiskey. One of them, a big man with a cruel mouth, had been harassing Clara all evening. He kept grabbing her, pulling her close to whisper crude things in her ear. She endured it with her usual stoic silence, her body rigid, her mind 1,000 miles away. But then he went too far. As she turned away from him, he lunged, grabbing a handful of her hair and yanking her head back. "I said, pour me another one, girl!" he roared, his foul breath hot on her face. Pain exploded in her scalp. A small cry escaped her lips, and that was all it took. Eli had been watching from his corner, his body tensed like a drawn bow. The sound of her cry was the release. He moved so fast he was a blur. He did not speak, did not issue a warning. One moment he was by the wall, the next he was on the drover. His first punch was a solid, brutal crack of bone against bone that sent the man stumbling backward, his hand flying from Clara's hair. The saloon went quiet, the piano sputtering into silence. The drover, shocked and enraged, charged forward with a bellow. Eli met him head-on. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. Eli moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency, his fists striking with the force and precision of a blacksmith's hammer. He broke the man's nose. He split his lip. He drove him back against the bar with a series of relentless body blows that stole the air from his lungs. The drover crumpled to the floor, dazed and bleeding. But Eli did not stop. A dark, cold rage had taken hold of him, the fury of years of loss and helplessness finally unleashed. He hauled the man to his feet and slammed him against the wall. His hand closing around his throat, he drew back his fist for another blow, a final, finishing one. "Stop!" The voice was Clara's. It was a raw, pleading cry. "Eli, please stop!" Her voice cut through the red haze of his anger. He froze, his fist poised in the air. He looked down at the bloody, broken man in his grip, and then he looked over at her. She was standing a few feet away, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for the drover, but for him. She was staring at him as if he were a monster. He let the man slide to the floor in a heap. The spell was broken. The fury receded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The saloon was utterly silent, every eye fixed on him. Without a word, he turned, strode over to Clara, and scooped her up into his arms. She was trembling violently, her body racked with shudders. He held her tight against his chest and carried her out of the saloon, leaving the silence and the stunned faces and the bleeding man behind him. He did not take her to a room above the bar. He carried her down the dark street, away from the center of town, to a small, dilapidated shack on the edge of a dry creek bed. It was a place he had been quietly repairing in his spare time, reinforcing the walls, patching the roof. He pushed the door open with his boot and carried her inside. He laid her gently on a narrow cot that was covered with a clean, coarse blanket. He lit a lantern, filling the small space with a soft, warm light. Then he built a small fire in the stone hearth, his movements economical and sure. He did not speak to her, did not touch her again. He gave her space, letting the quiet and the warmth of the fire do their work. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and savory broth. The morning sun was streaming through the single, clean window. She was lying on the cot, the blanket tucked around her. Across the small room, a pot of soup simmered over the hearth. Eli's shirt, washed and damp, was hanging from a peg near the fire to dry. He was nowhere to be seen. The silence was absolute. There was no piano music, no drunken shouts, no creak of footsteps on the floor above her. It was a peaceful, gentle silence she had not known in what felt like a lifetime. He had brought her here, to this clean, quiet place. He had beaten a man for her, carried her away, and then left her alone. He had not taken advantage of her fear, of her helplessness. He had simply given her sanctuary. The thought was so foreign, so contrary to everything she had come to expect from men, that it brought tears to her eyes. She was confused and shaken, and deeply, profoundly moved. The door opened, and he came in, carrying a bucket of fresh water. He stopped when he saw she was awake. They looked at each other for a long moment. Finally, she found her voice. It was soft, fragile. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you still here?" He set the bucket down and walked over to stand near the hearth, keeping a respectful distance. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes clear and direct, and his answer was simple and devastating. "Because you still do not believe anyone ever meant it when they stayed." The truth of his words settled over her, a heavy, comforting weight. He saw her. He saw the deepest, most wounded part of her, the part that had learned to expect abandonment, to see kindness as a precursor to betrayal. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing beside the cot. He reached out, his calloused hand moving slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He did not touch her face or her hair. He gently took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers. His touch was warm and firm and safe. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. In their depths, he saw a universe of pain, but he also saw a flicker of something new, something tentative and brave. He leaned down, his face drawing closer to hers. She could feel his breath on her cheek, could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. Her own eyes fluttered closed. Her lips parted slightly. He was going to kiss her, and she wanted him to. She wanted to feel, just for a moment, that she was desirable, that she was a woman and not a piece of property. But just as his lips were about to touch hers, she turned her head away. A single tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not like this." He did not press, he did not demand an explanation. He simply straightened up, his hand still holding hers. He understood. She wanted it, but not as a broken thing being rescued. Not while she was still afraid, still wearing the invisible chains of Mayor Reed. When she gave herself to him, it would be as a free woman. It would be her choice, and hers alone. A town like Alder Gulch feasts on secrets, but it chokes on open defiance. The story of the fight in the gilded cage spread like a prairie fire, whispered over laundry lines and poker tables. It was no longer a quiet matter. Eli Thatcher had drawn a line in the dust, and Mayor Reed could not allow it to stand. 2 days after the fight, Sheriff Calloway found Eli replacing a broken board on the livery stable wall. The sheriff did not come alone. 2 deputies, brutish men with dull eyes and heavy gun belts, flanked him. Calloway's face was slick with sweat, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol in a gesture that was meant to be casual, but was anything but. "Thatcher," Calloway said, his voice a wheeze. "The mayor wants a word with you." Eli did not stop his work. He set a nail and drove it home with 2 clean, powerful strikes of the hammer. Only then did he turn, his movements unhurried. He looked past Calloway to Mayor Reed, who was emerging from his office down the street. Reed was dressed, as always, in a suit that was too fine for the town. A politician's smile fixed on his face. "Mr. Thatcher," Reed began, his tone smooth and pleasant, as if they were discussing the weather. "It seems you caused quite a disturbance the other night. Brawling, destruction of property. This is a peaceable town. We have laws." Eli's gaze was steady. "The only thing I destroyed was a man's intention to harm a woman." Reed's smile tightened at the edges. "Nevertheless, your actions were excessive, disorderly. I am a reasonable man. I will waive the jail time. You will pay a fine of $50 for the damages, and then you will be on your way. You will leave Alder Gulch by sundown." It was a perfectly constructed trap. If Eli paid, he admitted guilt and Reed won. If he left, he abandoned Clara and Reed won. Eli let the silence stretch. He looked from Reed's smiling face to Calloway's nervous one, then to the deputies, who stood ready and eager for violence. His eyes, clear and cold as a winter sky, finally came back to rest on the mayor. "I am not paying you a single cent," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And I am not leaving." Reed's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of cold fury. "Then you are under arrest." "On what charge?" Eli asked, his stance unchanged. He was not reaching for his gun. He was not tensing for a fight. He stood there, solid as an oak, making them come to him. Vagrancy, resisting an officer, disturbing the peace, Calloway supplied, puffing out his chest. Take your pick. I have been working for my keep since I arrived, Eli stated, his voice cutting through the sheriff's bluster. I have disturbed no peace that was not already a lie, and you are not arresting me. He was not challenging them to a gunfight. He was challenging their authority, their very right to enforce a corrupt law. He was daring them to reveal their true nature in the broad daylight for all the town to see. People had stopped in the street to watch, their faces cautious and fearful. Reed saw it, saw the silent judgment in their eyes. A public brawl was one thing. Arresting a quiet man who had done nothing but stand his ground was another. It smelled wrong, and it would be remembered. With a look of pure venom, Reed gave a slight shake of his head to the sheriff. This was not the time. He pasted the smile back on his face. As you wish, Mr. Thatcher. But I assure you, this town has ways of dealing with unwelcome elements. You will find yourself friendless and hungry very soon. He turned and walked away, his deputies and a fuming Calloway trailing in his wake. Eli watched them go, then turned back to his work, picking up another nail. He knew this was not over. It was a declaration of war. He needed more than fists. He needed a weapon that Reed could not easily counter. He needed the truth, written in ink and sealed with the law. He started his search at the county records office, a small, dusty room attached to the judge's chambers. The clerk was a small, balding man named Abernathy, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that magnified his weary, perpetually frightened eyes. At first, Abernathy was unhelpful, stammering that all land deeds and probate records were private. But Eli did not threaten or cajole. He simply sat and waited, his quiet presence more unnerving than any threat. He spoke to the clerk about the weather, about the poor quality of the lumber from the local mill, about anything but the records. After 2 days of this silent siege, Abernathy cracked. Late one afternoon, when the office was empty, the clerk's voice was a frantic whisper. He will ruin me if he finds out. Who? Eli asked, though he knew the answer. Mayor Reed. All the important papers go across his desk before they are filed. He makes adjustments. Eli leaned forward slightly. I need to see the file for Samuel Bell, his deed, his will, any record of his debts. Abernathy was trembling. I cannot. It is locked away. Eli looked at the man, and for the first time, he let a sliver of his own history show. I had a sister. A man wearing a badge and carrying a legal paper took her away. The paper was a lie. I was too late to help her. I am not going to be too late this time. Something in his voice, the raw, unvarnished pain of it, reached the small, frightened man. Abernathy looked over his shoulder, then made a decision. Come back tonight. After midnight, the side window will be unlocked. That night, under a sliver of moon, Eli slipped through the window into the pitch-black office. Abernathy was there, holding a trembling candle, with shaking hands. He unlocked a heavy cabinet and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and a file folder. He opened the ledger to the page for Samuel Bell. Eli saw it immediately. The long list of debts, all from the same supplier, one owned by a silent partner, Mayor Reed. The dates were clustered illogically, the signatures just slightly different from the others in the book. It was a clumsy forgery, but one backed by a judge and a sheriff. Then Abernathy handed him the file. Inside was a copy of Samuel Bell's last will and testament. It was simple and clear. In the event of his death, everything, the land, the house, the livestock, was to pass to his beloved wife, Clara Bell. The document was notarized and dated a full year before his death. At the bottom, a crucial line was written in plain, clear script. I leave this world in debt to no man. save for the kindness of my wife. It was the proof. The entire claim Reed had made was a lie. The foundation of Clara's servitude was built on sand. Eli spent the next day trying to find a way to speak with her alone, but she was watched constantly. He knew he could not simply walk up to her in the saloon. The knowledge he held was explosive, and it had to be handled with care. But fate, in its own cruel way, intervened. That evening, a deputy named Harkin, one of the brutes who had been with Calloway, saw Clara taking a bucket of trash to the bins in the back alley. He followed her out, his intentions clear in his swagger. Eli, who had been watching the saloon from across the street, saw him go and immediately started to move. Harkin cornered her between the wall and the overflowing bins. "The mayor's getting tired of your new friend, Clara," he sneered, his body blocking her escape. "Heard some talk about a mining camp. Long, cold winters up there. A woman gets real lonely." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The mining camp. The threat was no longer a whispered rumor. It was here, real and ugly and stinking of stale whiskey. The alley walls seemed to close in on her. Her breath caught in her chest, sharp and painful. The deputy's leering face began to swim before her eyes. The sounds of the saloon faded into a dull roar in her ears. She could not breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid down the rough wall, her hands clawing at her throat. A desperate, silent scream locked inside her. She was having a panic attack, a complete collapse of the iron control she had maintained for so long. When Eli rounded the corner, he saw the deputy looming over her, a look of confused pleasure on his face. Clara was curled into a ball on the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. A cold, deadly calm settled over Eli. "Get away from her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a razor. Harkin spun around, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but he stopped. The look on Eli's face was not one of anger. It was something far worse. It was a look of utter certainty, the look of a man who had already decided the outcome and was merely waiting for the formality of violence. Harkin, for all his bluster, was a coward. He took a step back, then another. "She just fell," he stammered, before turning and scurrying back into the safety of the saloon. Eli did not spare him a glance. He knelt beside Clara in the dirt and filth of the alley. He did not touch her at first. He just spoke her name, his voice low and steady, a lifeline in the storm of her panic. "Clara, it is me, Eli. You are safe. Breathe with me. Just breathe." Slowly, slowly, the roaring in her ears subsided. The crushing weight on her chest lessened. She was able to draw a ragged, shuddering breath. Tears began to stream down her face. Silent, hot trails of shame and terror. She was crying in the dust at the feet of a man she barely knew, utterly broken. He helped her to her feet and led her away from the saloon, away from the town, to the quiet solitude of the shack by the creek. He sat her down on the cot and gave her a tin cup of water, his movements gentle and patient. She drank, the cool water a balm to her raw throat. She sat there for a long time, the tears still falling, until, finally, the story began to spill out of her, a poisoned torrent she had held back for too long. "After Samuel was killed," she began, her voice a shredded whisper, "I was alone. I was so afraid. Men started coming around the ranch, looking at it, looking at me. They said I had no right to be there. I went to the law. I went to Sheriff Calloway, and he just laughed. He said a woman could not run a ranch alone." She took a shuddering breath, her eyes fixed on the floor. "So I went to the mayor. He was kind. He listened. He told me he would protect me. He said he would make sure no one could take my land. All I had to do was sign some papers to make him my legal protector until things settled down." She looked up at Eli, her eyes swimming with a self-loathing that was painful to witness. "I begged him to help me. I was so grateful. I signed everything he put in front of me. I did not even read it. She buried her face in her hands. The next day, he came back with the sheriff and the debt ledger. He said the papers I had signed were an acknowledgement of Samuel's debts, and that the ranch was now his. He said his protection was keeping me out of a debtor's prison. His price was my life. She fell silent, her shoulders shaking. She felt filthy, stupid, unworthy of anything good. She had not been a victim who was taken. She had walked willingly into the trap, begging the wolf to save her from the other predators in the woods. Eli listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not offer condolences or excuses. He did not flinch from the ugliness of her confession. When she was finally quiet, exhausted, and empty, he simply reached out and took the tin cup from her trembling hands. Then he did something else. He reached out again and gently took her hand, lacing his calloused fingers with hers. He did not say, "It was not your fault." He did not say, "You were scared." He said nothing. He just held her hand, his touch a silent testament. "I have heard the worst of you, the part you are most ashamed of, and I am still here." She did not pull away this time. She clung to his hand as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. In his silence, in his refusal to pity her, she found a strange and unexpected strength. He was not judging her. He was simply bearing witness. Later that evening, after she had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Eli began to make his own preparations. He packed his saddlebags, checked his gun, and gathered the few things he owned. The next morning, he was waiting for her when she woke. He had made coffee and had a small fire going. He told her then what he had found. He told her about the will, about the forged ledger, about the lie that had been the foundation of her entire ordeal. "The land is yours, Clara, free and clear. It has been yours all along." He laid his plan before her. They would leave Alder Gulch together. They would ride to the county seat, a bigger town with a federal marshal, and file the will. They would come back with the full force of the real law behind them and take back what was hers. He offered her a future, a way out, a chance to reclaim her life. He offered her hope. And she refused. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted fear. "You do not understand. Reed will never let me go. He will kill us both before he lets me walk away. It is impossible." To hope again, to believe in justice, was a risk she was no longer capable of taking. The cost of that hope, should it fail, would be more than she could bear. He did not argue with her. He simply nodded and went about his day, mending the shack, chopping firewood, creating an island of order and peace in a world of chaos. He was giving her space, letting her live with the new knowledge, with the possibility he had laid at her feet. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered against the tin roof of the shack, a relentless, drumming rhythm that shut out the rest of the world. Inside, the only light came from 2 flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Eli sat on a small stool, cleaning his pistol. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, watching the rain streak down the single window pane. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with everything unsaid, with the choice she had to make. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft he almost did not hear it over the storm. "I do not want to feel ashamed anymore." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Her face, in the candlelight, was a pale, luminous oval. She looked vulnerable, but there was a new resolve in her eyes. The shame had been his most powerful weapon, the cage she had built around her own heart. Now, she was ready to tear it down. She stood up and walked over to him. The shack was so small that it took only 2 steps. She stood before him, and the air grew thick with a raw, gentle intimacy. She reached up, her hands trembling slightly, and her fingers went to the top button of the high, suffocating collar of her dress. She fumbled with it for a second, then another. It was the symbol of her captivity, the wall she kept between herself and the world. She was offering him the broken, bruised and shamed parts of herself. She was offering him her trust. He reached up and his hand covered hers, stilling her fingers. His touch was warm and steady. She looked into his eyes, confused. "Only when you want me to," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. He was giving it all back to her. The choice, the power, the control. He would not take what was not freely, joyfully given. He was proving, in that one small gesture, that he was nothing like the men who had hurt her. He was a man who waited. A single tear slipped from her eye and traced a path down her cheek. A small, shaky smile touched her lips. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in an eternity. The last of her fear dissolved in a wave of profound, aching gratitude. She leaned in close, her lips almost touching his. She paused, drawing out the moment, savoring the feeling of being in control of her own destiny. Then she whispered, the words both a surrender and a victory. "I do not want you to stop this time." The morning broke, quiet and gray. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of damp earth and creosote. Inside the shack, a fragile peace held sway. They moved around the small space in a new kind of silence, one that was not empty but full of a new, unspoken language. When he handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushed against hers, and neither of them pulled away. They did not speak of the night before, of the storm inside or the one out. There was no need. Something had been irrevocably altered in the space between them. A wall of shame and fear dismantled brick by painstaking brick. When he told her he was riding out, she felt a flicker of the old panic, the ingrained fear of abandonment. But it was different this time. He was not leaving her. He was fighting for her. "To Willow Creek," he said, checking the cinch on his saddle. "The county seat. I will file the will with the registrar there. When I come back, we will have the law on our side, the real law." She stood in the doorway of the shack, her arms wrapped around herself. "Be careful, Eli." He turned, and the look he gave her was a promise. "I will be back before you know it. Just stay here. Stay out of sight." He swung up onto his horse, gave her one last steady look, and then rode east, a lone, determined figure against the rising sun. Eli had underestimated the reach of Reed's fear. He had barely been gone 2 hours when Abernathy, the little clerk from the records office, scurried from his dusty room and straight to the mayor's house. He was a man caught between two terrors, and he had chosen the one that was closer, the one that could ruin him before lunch. He told Reed everything, about the midnight visit, the will, the stranger's plan to go to the county seat. Reed did not rage. He did not shout. He listened with a cold, reptilian stillness. His eyes narrowing, he dismissed the trembling clerk with a wave of his hand. This Thatcher was more resourceful than he had anticipated. An appeal to a higher authority could unravel everything he had so carefully built. But the man had made a fatal error. He had left his weapon behind. Clara was gathering firewood near the creek bed when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was Harkin and another of Reed's men. There was no pretense this time, no sneering threats. They simply dismounted, their faces hard and emotionless. She dropped the wood and tried to run, but they were on her in an instant. Harkin grabbed her arms and pinned them behind her back while the other man produced a strip of cloth, stuffing it into her mouth to stifle her screams. They dragged her back to a waiting wagon, threw her in the back like a sack of grain, and drove her not to the jail, but to the mayor's manor at the end of the main street. The house was a monument to Reed's vanity, a 2-story structure of painted white wood with glass windows and a wide porch. Inside, it was a prison of velvet curtains and polished furniture. They shoved her into an upstairs bedroom and locked the door. The windows were latticed, the glass thick. She was a bird back in a gilded cage. But this time, the door was bolted, and the owner was done with his pretense of kindness. When Eli rode back into the valley at dusk, a cold premonition settled over him. The air was too still. The shack, when he reached it, was a scene of brutal violation. The door hung open, splintered near the handle. Inside, the small, peaceful space they had shared had been ransacked. The cot was overturned, the blanket thrown in a corner. The ashes from the hearth were kicked across the floorboards. Clara was gone. A deep, animal rage, cold and pure, washed through him. He saw the tracks of the wagon, the scuffle in the dirt. He knew, with absolute certainty, who was responsible. He mounted his horse and rode into town, not with the stealth of an observer, but with the focused fury of an avenger. The setting sun cast his long shadow before him as he galloped down the main street, stopping directly in front of the sheriff's office. He did not dismount. "Calloway!" His voice was not a shout, but a low, dangerous command that carried in the evening air. "Where is she?" The sheriff emerged, his hand on his gun, his face a mask of feigned ignorance. "Thatcher, back so soon? I thought the mayor advised you to leave town." "I am only going to ask you one more time," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. "Where is Clara Bell?" "The woman is the mayor's ward," Calloway blustered, gesturing to the two deputies who had materialized at his side. "Her welfare is his concern, not that of a drifter and a troublemaker. Now, I am placing you under arrest for—" Calloway never finished his sentence. Eli swung down from his horse, moving with a speed that caught them all by surprise. He drove his shoulder into the sheriff's paunchy midsection, sending the man gasping to the ground. Before the deputies could react, Eli had Calloway's pistol in his hand, but he had been reckless, blinded by rage. As he straightened up, one of the deputies brought the butt of his own rifle down hard across the back of Eli's head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and then everything went black. He awoke to the damp, musty smell of a jail cell and the throbbing agony in his head. He was lying on a thin, filthy mattress. Through the bars of his cell, he could see the sheriff's empty office. They had taken his gun, his knife, everything. He was trapped, helpless, while Clara was in the hands of a monster. He surged to his feet, ignoring the wave of dizziness, and gripped the iron bars, shaking them in a futile display of rage. He was a fool. His anger had made him predictable, and he had walked right into their trap. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting a pale, square patch of light on the cell floor. He had slumped onto the cot, his head in his hands, forcing the rage down, forcing himself to think, when he heard a faint scratching sound at the office's back door. He looked up. The door creaked open, and a slim figure slipped inside. It was the stable boy, the lanky youth from the livery. His eyes were wide with fear, but he moved with a determined silence. In his hand, he held a large iron key. "Mr. Thatcher?" the boy whispered. Eli was at the bars in an instant. "What are you doing here, son? You will get yourself killed." "You helped my PA with that wagon wheel," the boy said, as if that explained everything. "You paid me fair. No one else does. I saw them drag you in here. It ain't right. What they did to Mrs. Bell ain't right either." He fumbled with the key in the lock. After a tense moment, it turned with a heavy clank. The boy pulled the door open. "Your horse is saddled out back. Your gun belt is in the saddlebag. It is all I could do." Eli stepped out of the cell and placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked the young man square in the eye. "I will not forget this. Now get out of here. Go home and do not speak of this to anyone." The boy nodded and disappeared into the night as silently as he had come. Eli retrieved his gun and strapped it on, the familiar weight a cold comfort. He was no longer just a drifter. He was an escaped prisoner, a fugitive, but he was also free. He would not make the same mistake twice. This was not a war he could win with a head-on charge. He needed an army. Meanwhile, in her velvet prison, Clara was fighting her own war. After the initial wave of terror had subsided, it was replaced by a cold, unfamiliar fury. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in her stomach, but it no longer paralyzed her. She thought of Eli, of the quiet strength in his hands, of the belief in his eyes. He had given her back a piece of her own soul, and she would not let Reed take it from her again without a fight. She had a single guard, a hulking man named Silas, the same man who had grabbed her in the saloon weeks ago, stationed outside her door. She spent a day observing, listening. He was lazy, easily bored, and had a weakness for the mayor's whiskey. Late in the afternoon of the second day, she put her plan into action. She began to moan, clutching her stomach and crying out in pain. After several minutes, Silas unlocked the door and peered in, his expression one of annoyance. "What is all the racket?" "It is my stomach," she gasped, curling into a ball on the floor. "Please, a glass of water." He grumbled but went to fetch it. When he returned, she waited until he was close, and then she knocked the glass from his hand, sending water and glass shattering across the polished floor. "Clumsy oaf!" she cried, a calculated shriek of frustration. As he bent down to curse and pick up the larger shards of glass, his back was to her for a precious few seconds. A ring of keys hung from his belt. Her hands shot out, quick and silent as a snake. Her fingers closed around the heavy, cold brass of the bedroom key, and she slipped it beneath her dress. When he straightened up, she was back to moaning, her face a mask of pain. Annoyed, he told her to be quiet, locked the door, and went back to his post. She waited for hours, her heart pounding, until the house grew quiet and she could hear the deep, rhythmic snores of her guard in the hallway. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and slipped out. The hallway was dark. She crept past the sleeping guard, down the grand staircase, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. The front door would be bolted. Her only hope was a window in the study. She found it, a large sash window that looked out over the side yard. It was not locked. She struggled with the heavy frame, slowly, painfully pushing it upward, just enough to squeeze through. She threw one leg over the sill, then the other, and dropped into the bushes below. The fall was only a few feet, but a sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. A shard from the broken water glass, still on the floor of her room, must have embedded itself in her shoe. She ignored it, adrenaline coursing through her. She was free. She scrambled out of the bushes and ran, limping heavily, into the darkness of the town. She did not get far. The pain in her leg was excruciating, and her strength was fading. After a few blocks, she stumbled and fell in the middle of the street, the world dissolving into a gray, swirling fog. Her last conscious thought was of Eli. She was woken by the gentle touch of a cool cloth on her forehead. She was in a small, simple room, lying in a narrow bed. A woman with a kind, worried face was leaning over her. It was Martha, the blacksmith's wife. "Hush now, dear," the woman said softly. "You are safe here. My husband found you in the street. You have a nasty cut on your leg, but it is clean now, and bandaged." The blacksmith had seen Eli help his wife with a heavy load of supplies a week ago. A small act of kindness in a town that had forgotten the meaning of the word. When he saw Clara collapse, he had not hesitated. He carried her to his home behind the smithy, risking the mayor's wrath. Eli found her there an hour later, guided by the stable boy. He saw her lying in the bed, pale and still. A thick bandage wrapped around her lower leg, and the cold fury in his chest gave way to a wave of profound, aching relief. He knelt by the bed and took her hand. Her skin was cool to the touch. Her eyes fluttered open and focused on his face. A weak smile touched her lips. She was broken and wounded and exhausted, but she was not defeated. She had fought her way back. "You are a fool, Eli Thatcher," she whispered, her voice a reedy thread. "I have been called worse," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. They were quiet for a long moment, their hands clasped together. They were bruised and battered, but they were together. She squeezed his hand, her dark eyes searching his face. "You still want to leave with me?" she asked, the question fragile, full of the fear that she was too much trouble, too damaged to be worth all this. He leaned down, his face close to hers, and his expression was as solid and unyielding as granite. "Not without taking back everything that is yours." The sun was high and hot the next day when Eli walked into the center of town. He was not alone. Behind him walked the blacksmith, a heavy hammer swinging loosely in his hand. The stable boy walked with them, his youthful fear eclipsed by a defiant loyalty. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, escorted Clara, who leaned on her for support. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes held a new, hard light. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning. They did not go to the saloon or the sheriff's office. They walked directly to the small, dusty building that housed the county records and the chambers of Judge Hemlock. Word of the strange procession spread quickly. People emerged from the general store, from the hotel, from the shadows of the saloons. They watched, their faces a mixture of fear and a dangerous, long-suppressed curiosity. Mayor Reed and Sheriff Calloway appeared, drawn by the disturbance. Reed's face was a mask of pleasant inquiry, but his eyes were chips of cold, black stone. Eli stopped on the steps of the judge's office. He turned to face the growing crowd, his voice clear and steady, carrying in the still, hot air. "My name is Eli Thatcher," he began. "I came to this town following whispers of injustice. I found more than whispers. I found a rot that calls itself the law." He looked directly at Mayor Reed. "I accuse this man, Mayor Reed, of fraud, of theft, and of holding a free woman in bondage through lies and coercion." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not a back-alley whisper. This was a public accusation, a direct challenge to the throne. Reed laughed, a smooth, condescending sound. "These are the ravings of a fugitive and a madman. This man broke out of jail. Sheriff, arrest him." Calloway took a hesitant step forward, but the blacksmith moved to stand beside Eli, his grip tightening on his hammer. He did not say a word, but his presence was a clear and potent threat. The crowd murmured, their attention shifting, their loyalties wavering. "I have proof," Eli continued, his voice cutting through the tension. He held up a folded piece of paper, a copy he had made of Samuel Bell's will. "This is the last will and testament of Samuel Bell. It proves that he left his land, free and clear of all debt, to his wife, Clara Bell. The debts Mayor Reed claimed are a fiction, a forgery used to steal a man's legacy and a woman's freedom. I demand that Judge Hemlock open the official records and show this town the truth." All eyes turned to the door of the office. After a long moment, it opened, and Judge Hemlock stood there, blinking in the bright sun. He looked old and frail, a man shrunken by his own compromises. "This is highly irregular," the judge stammered, his eyes darting toward Reed. "Show us the ledger, Judge!" a voice yelled from the crowd. It was a prospector Eli had shared a coffee with. "Let us see the will," another voice added. The murmur grew into a low roar. The fear that had held the town in its grip for so long was beginning to crack. The people were tired of being bullied, of seeing their neighbors broken on the wheel of Reed's ambition. They smelled blood in the water, and their long-dormant sense of justice was stirring. Reed's face was now pale with fury. "This is mob rule. Judge, I order you to have this man removed." But the judge was no longer looking at Reed. He was looking at the faces in the crowd, at the hard, expectant eyes of the men and women he was supposed to serve. He saw the blacksmith's hammer. He saw the cold, unwavering certainty in Eli Thatcher's gaze. He was a weak man, and his first instinct was always to bow to the strongest pressure. For the first time, that pressure was not coming from the mayor. "Bring the ledger, Abernathy," the judge said, his voice a dry croak. The little clerk, looking terrified, scurried out with the heavy, leather-bound book. He placed it on a crate on the porch. The judge, with trembling hands, opened it to the page for Samuel Bell, The crowd pushed forward to see. Eli stepped aside. "Clara," he said softly, leaning on Martha. Clara limped forward. She stood before the crowd, her bandaged leg a testament to her escape. She was no longer the silent woman in the crimson dress. She was Samuel Bell's widow, and she had found her voice. She began to speak, her voice weak at first, but growing stronger with every word. She told them everything. She told them of her husband's death, of her fear, of how she had gone to the mayor for protection. She told them how he had been so kind, so understanding, and how she had signed the papers he gave her, trusting him completely. "He did not protect me," she said, her voice ringing with a pain that was raw and real. "He preyed on my grief. He stole my husband's land, the home we built with our own hands. He took my name, my freedom, and my hope. He told me I owed him a debt. The debt was my life." Her testimony fell into a profound silence. Every person in that crowd knew a piece of her story, had seen her suffering, had looked away out of fear. Now, they could not look away. Her words were a mirror, and in them, they saw their own cowardice, their own silent complicity. The murmur of support that had begun earlier now swelled into a tide of open anger directed at the mayor. Judge Hemlock looked from the faces in the crowd to the ledger in front of him. He looked at the forced, clumsy signatures. At the will Eli still held, he could feel the power shifting, the ground crumbling beneath the old order. With a deep, shuddering sigh, the last of his loyalty to Reed evaporated. "The signatures in this ledger do not match the legal signature on file for Samuel Bell," the judge announced, his voice surprisingly firm. "They are forgeries. Any and all claims of debt against the estate of Samuel Bell are hereby declared null and void. The Bell property belongs to his widow, Clara Bell, by right of this legally executed will." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. It was over. The lie had been broken. Clara was free. Reed stood frozen for a second, his face a mask of disbelief, then pure, unrestrained hatred. His reputation, his power, his entire empire of fear had been dismantled in a matter of minutes by a drifter and a broken woman. In that moment, the thin veneer of the politician, the businessman, cracked, revealing the feral predator beneath. His hand blurred as it dropped to the pistol on his hip. "This is my town!" he screamed, his voice a raw shriek of fury. He was not aiming for the judge. He was aiming for Eli. But Eli had been waiting for it. He had known that a man like Reed, when stripped of his power, had only one language left. As Reed's gun began to clear the leather, Eli was already moving, his own draw a fluid, practiced motion. 2 shots exploded in the street, so close together they sounded almost like one. Reed was thrown backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face, a dark, spreading stain blossoming on the front of his fine white shirt. Eli stood his ground, the smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol, his expression grim and sad. There was no triumph in it, only the weary finality of a thing that had to be done. Reed collapsed in the dust, his reign over. In the ringing silence that followed, Sheriff Calloway looked from the body of his patron to the hard faces in the crowd, and then to the cold, steady gaze of Eli Thatcher, without a word. Calloway turned, unpinned his badge and let it fall to the dirt, and practically ran to the livery stable. No one tried to stop him. A new election was called for the following week. The rot had been cut out of Alder Gulch. They rode out to the ranch 2 days later. The townspeople had helped them, offering supplies, a wagon, and words of encouragement. But as they crested the hill and saw the small, dilapidated house and the weed-choked fields, the true scale of the task ahead of them settled in. The victory in town had been loud and dramatic. The battle here would be quiet, slow, and grinding. The land was dry, the soil cracked and hard. The roof of the house leaked in a dozen places. The door hung from one hinge, a grim echo of the gate. The grave Eli had cleared was already sprouting new weeds. Rebuilding was not easy. It was hard. Relentless work that strained their bodies and their spirits. The past was not a ghost they had left behind in town. It had followed them, lingering in the shadows of the empty house. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, but the nights were long and difficult. Clara was plagued by nightmares. She would wake up screaming, her hands clawing at her throat, the feeling of the gag in her mouth, the terror of the mining camp still fresh and real. Eli would hold her, his own body rigid, offering what little comfort he could, his words of reassurance sounding hollow even to his own ears. He had his own demons. In the quiet of the evenings, he would sit on the porch, staring out at the darkening land, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was a man built of silence and sorrow, and the peace he had fought so hard to win for Clara did not extend to himself. The violence he had unleashed, the man he had killed, it all added another layer to the weight he already carried. They struggled. The shared trauma that had forged their bond now sometimes acted as a wedge between them. They argued over small things, the right way to mend a fence, the placement of a new window pane, because the larger, unspoken things were too vast and terrifying to confront. There were days of tense silence, of missed connections and frustrated tears, but they never turned away from each other. They would argue, and then they would hold each other in the darkness, two broken people clinging together, trying to piece themselves back into a whole. One night, after a particularly difficult day, they sat outside under a sky awash with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. The air was cool and clean. The house, for all its flaws, was theirs. They had managed to patch the worst of the roof, and the fields were slowly being cleared. A fragile sense of home was beginning to take root. Eli was quieter than usual, a deep, brooding stillness about him. Clara reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He did not pull away, but he flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscle. He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, she saw that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The strong, unshakable man who had faced down a corrupt town was breaking apart in front of her. "My sister's name was Lydia," he said, his voice low and ragged, the words torn from a place deep inside him he had kept locked for years. "She was all I had left. I went away to work, to earn enough for us. I thought I was keeping her safe by leaving." He looked away, up at the indifferent stars. "A sheriff, a man of the law, sold her. He sold her like she was cattle. I was gone for 6 months. When I came back," his voice broke. He took a deep, shuddering breath before he could continue. "I was too late. I found her buried in a ditch. I failed her. Clara, I was supposed to protect her, and I left her alone. I failed." The confession hung in the night air, a raw wound of guilt and grief he had carried alone for a decade. He finally let his head drop, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Clara moved closer, her heart aching for him, for the boy he had been, for the pain he had never allowed himself to show. She did not speak. She simply wrapped her arms around him and held him, her hand stroking the back of his head. She held him as he had held her through her nightmares, offering a silent, steady presence in the face of overwhelming pain. She let him grieve, let the years of pent-up sorrow pour out of him under the vast, silent sky. When the last of the shudders had passed, and he was quiet, leaning his heavy weight against her, she spoke, her lips close to his ear. Her voice was soft, but it held the strength of a survivor, the clarity of a person who had been to the edge of despair and back. She said, "You did not fail me." The seasons turned, each one a slow, steady brushstroke painting over the scars of the past. The brutal heat of summer gave way to an autumn of crisp, golden light that set the valley ablaze. Winter followed, blanketing the land in a deep, quiet snow that muffled the world and forced them inward, into the warmth of the small house they were slowly rebuilding. And then came spring, a miracle of green shoots and birdsong, the creek swelling with melted snow, the air thick with the smell of new life. With each passing season, the ranch was reborn. The house, which had been a hollow-eyed skull, now had a solid roof and clean glass in its windows. A new, sturdy fence marched across the fields, its posts straight and true, each one set by Eli's hands. Clara had planted a small garden near the porch, and the sight of the first green beans pushing up through the dark soil had brought tears to her eyes. The land was no longer just a place of memory and pain. It was a place of promise. Clara, too, was being reborn. In the long winter evenings, a new tradition began. Twice a week, the daughters of two neighboring ranchers would ride over. They would gather around the rough-hewn table in the main room, their faces glowing in the warm lantern light, and Clara would teach them to read. She used old almanacs, the Bible, and the one precious novel Eli had given her. She was a patient teacher, her voice soft and encouraging. She remembered the shame of not being able to read a legal document, the powerlessness of it. As she watched these young girls sound out words, their brows furrowed in concentration, she felt a profound sense of purpose. This was the dream she had confessed to Eli in a moment of bitter despair, now made real. She was not just teaching them letters, she was giving them armor, a tool for a world that was not always kind to women. She was building a future, not just for them, but for herself. Eli found his own quiet rhythm. His days were spent in the relentless, honest labor of the ranch. He mended what was broken, built what was needed, his movements economical and sure. The work settled him, grounding him in the simple reality of wood and stone and soil. The restless, watchful energy that had carried him across the country began to dissipate, replaced by the steady strength of a man who has found his place. In the evenings, after the work was done, he would often sit on the porch steps with an old, battered guitar he had bought from a traveling tinker. He was not a gifted musician. He knew only a handful of simple, mournful tunes, melodies he had learned in cow camps and lonely bunkhouses. He played for himself, the quiet notes drifting out into the vast, starry darkness. Clara would often sit in the doorway, listening, her mending forgotten in her lap. The music was like him, unadorned, honest, and full of a deep, unspoken melancholy. He was still a man of few words, still rough around the edges. His past a landscape of shadows she knew she would never fully explore, but the sharp edges had softened. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled a newborn calf, the quiet satisfaction in his eyes as he looked over a newly mended fence. He was no longer the mysterious, dangerous stranger who had walked into the saloon. He was the steady presence at her back, the quiet strength that had allowed her to heal. He was home. As spring warmed into summer, they hosted their first gathering. The blacksmith and his wife, Martha, came, along with the two ranching families whose daughters Clara was teaching. They sat at a long table Eli had built, sharing roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread. It was a simple, awkward affair at first, the air thick with the unspoken history of the town. But then people began to talk. They did not speak to Clara with the hushed, pitying tones of before. They asked for her advice on when to plant corn. They complimented the sturdiness of Eli's repairs on the barn. They treated her not as a victim, but as a peer, a fellow survivor in a hard land. They respected her, not for what she had endured, but for how she had survived. When she laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound, the last of the shadows seemed to flee from the small ranch. The final threat, when it came, was not a violent storm, but a cold, creeping shadow from the past. 3 men rode up to the ranch one afternoon. They were not local thugs like Harkin. These men were different. They wore city clothes, bowler hats, and carried themselves with the cold arrogance of hired professionals. They looked out of place in the valley, like crows in a field of doves. Eli saw them coming from a long way off. He was splitting logs by the side of the house, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He did not stop, but his body grew tense, every muscle coiled and ready. He had known, on some level, that Reed's influence had not died with him. A man like that leaves behind a web of favors and tainted business deals. Clara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the men, and a flicker of the old fear crossed her face before she suppressed it, her expression hardening into a familiar, resolute mask. Eli set the axe down and walked to the foot of the porch steps, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching riders. He did not reach for his gun. He just waited, his presence a silent, immovable wall. The lead rider, a man with a thin mustache and dead gray eyes, stopped his horse a few yards away. "Are you the woman Clara Bell?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He ignored Eli completely. "I am," Clara said, her own voice steady. "We represent the interests of the Northern Mining Syndicate," the man continued. "We hold a note of debt against this property, signed over by the late Mayor Reed as collateral for a business loan. The note is past due. We are here to collect on that collateral. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, a piece of paper that represented the last dying gasp of Reed's corrupt empire. Eli took a slow step forward. "This land is not for sale," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And it carries no debt. Any business you had with Reed died with him." The man with the mustache finally deigned to look at Eli. A faint, contemptuous smile touched his lips. "We are not here to negotiate with squatters. We have a legal document. We will be back in 2 days with the federal marshal to enforce it." He knew that the local law was now honest, so he invoked a higher, more distant authority, one that would only see the ink on the paper, not the truth behind it. Eli's hand drifted down, his fingers brushing the worn leather of his gun belt. He had killed once to protect this place, to protect her. He would do it again without a moment's hesitation. But before he could speak, before the situation could escalate into the familiar language of violence, Clara stepped down from the porch. She walked to stand beside Eli, her small frame straight and unbowed. She was not hiding behind him. She was standing with him, an equal partner in the fight. She looked the man in the gray eyes directly in his own. There was no fear in her gaze, only a cold, burning fire that had been forged in the deepest pits of shame and despair. "There is no ink on a piece of paper that can tell the truth of this land," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet afternoon air. "This land was paid for. It was paid for with my husband's blood, spilled into this very soil. It was paid for with my sweat, and my tears, and my shame. It was paid for with the truth, which we had to drag out into the light from the darkness where men like you and Mayor Reed tried to bury it." She took another step forward, her chin lifted. "This land, and the woman who stands on it, are not for sale. We are not for collateral. We are not for the taking. You can come back with the marshal. You can come back with the United States Army. We will still be here. Now, get off my property." The 3 men were silent. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone, broken woman. Instead, they faced a man who was clearly willing to die where he stood, and a woman whose righteous fury was more formidable than any weapon. They saw the truth in her eyes, the absolute conviction that could not be bought or bullied. The man with the mustache held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He had seen enough to know this was a fight they could not win, not without a cost his employers were unwilling to pay. Without another word, he and his men turned their horses and rode away, their dust trail a fading signature of a threat that had finally been vanquished. Eli and Clara stood together, watching them go. They did not speak. They did not touch. They just stood side by side as the sun began to dip below the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the peace of a battle finally, truly won. They watched until the last of the riders had disappeared over the horizon and the last sliver of the sun had sunk from view, leaving them alone in the soft, gathering twilight. Later that night, the small house was filled with the warm, flickering light of a single candle. The argument, the tension, the ever-present threat of the outside world felt 1,000 miles away. Clara was curled beside him on the narrow bed, her head resting on his chest. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm that had become the sound of her own safety. She took his hand, the one that had cleared her husband's grave, that had fought for her, that had held her through her darkest nights, and she placed it over her own heart. He could feel its strong, steady beat beneath his palm. "You waited," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. "Through all of it, you waited until I was ready." He did not answer, but his fingers tightened slightly over hers. She tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes luminous in the candlelight. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated hope and desire. "Now," she whispered, her voice full of a future they had earned together. "I want everything." Eli did not answer. He just looked down at her, his own gaze full of a love that was deeper and more profound than any words he could ever speak. He shifted his weight, pulling her closer, a silent promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. He just stayed, solid and true, until the last candle died and left them in the peaceful, promising dark. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.